The morning sun of Vareth 9 cast purple shadows across the training grounds of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy, and Sergeant Kethvorn stood tall before his newest batch of recruits with all four of his muscular arms crossed against his chest in a display of authority that had intimidated soldiers for decades. His scales shimmered from a confident blue to deeper shades of violet as he surveyed the 43 beings assembled before him, each one representing a different corner of the vast galactic civilization that humanity had only recently been invited to join there, with Tellurians with their elongated skulls and 3 eyes that could see in spectrums no other species could perceive. And there were Krethali warriors whose rocky exterior made them walking fortresses. And there were delicate Vinchari whose tentacles could manipulate objects with surgical precision. And then there was the human corporal Elena Vasquez, stood at the end of the formation, her olive skin and dark hair marking her as utterly unremarkable compared to the exotic beings around her. And Kethvorn allowed himself a small snort of amusement when his gaze passed over Hirsch. She was the 17th human to pass through his training program since Earth had joined the Coalition 5 years ago. And like all the others, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that he found almost charming in its naivety. Today, we address a subject that most of you will find amusing, Kethvorn announced, his voice carrying across the training grounds through the translator implants that allowed all species to understand one another. And that subject is primitive kinetic weapons. A ripple of laughter passed through the assembled recruits, just as Kethvorn had expected, and he allowed the moment to breathe before continuing with his lesson. The contested zones established by the Treaty of Vareth prohibit the use of energy weapons in 17 star systems across the galaxy, he explained, while pacing before his students with the practiced ease of someone who had given this lecture hundreds of times. And this means that soldiers deployed to these regions must rely on what we classify as Category 7 primitives. He gestured to a table behind him where various weapons lay on display, and Elena felt her eyes narrow as she studied them with an intensity that went unnoticed by everyone. Around her there was a simple sling made of leather straps, and there was a wooden spear with a metal tip that looked like it belonged in a museum. And there was a bow that appeared to have been constructed by someone who had only heard descriptions of what a bow should look like. These weapons, Kethvorn continued with barely concealed disdain dripping from every word, represent the absolute lowest form of military technology that any spacefaring civilization could be forced to employ. And frankly, they are an embarrassment. More laughter from the recruits, and Elena remained perfectly still while her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Most species in the Coalition abandoned kinetic weapons approximately 3,000 years ago when plasma technology became standard, the sergeant explained. But the treaties require us to maintain some capability with these ancient tools. And so, here we are. He picked up the bow and held it before the class like a parent, showing a child's primitive drawing to dinner guests. And his tone made it clear exactly what he thought of the weapon in his hands. The Tellurians never developed kinetic weapons at all because their homeworlds, low gravity, made projectiles impractical, he said. And the Krethali used kinetic weapons only for approximately 200 years before discovering directed energy. And the Vinchari considered physical violence beneath their species entirely until they joined our military alliance. He set the bow down and turned to face Elena directly, and something cruel sparkled in his 4 eyes as he prepared to make his point. And then we have humans, he said. And the way he pronounced the word made it sound like something unpleasant he had stepped in, who spent the vast majority of their existence as a species doing nothing but throwing sharpened sticks at each other. The laughter this time was louder, and several recruits turned to look at Elena with expressions ranging from pity to amusement to outright contempt. Humans are new to our coalition, Keth Vorn continued while Elena remained motionless. And their military technology is approximately 400 years behind the galactic standard, which means they are uniquely suited for primitive weapon assignments that no other species wants. He smiled, revealing rows of small sharp teeth that had evolved for tearing through the thick-skinned prey of his homeworld. Consider it a compliment, he added with mock sincerity, as you are being assigned duties that match your natural capabilities. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, a cold settling of purpose that her grandmother would have recognized immediately, and she raised her hand with the calm precision of someone who had made a decision. Keth Vorn's scales flickered with surprise, because humans rarely spoke during his lectures, preferring to absorb their humiliation in silence. "Yes, Corporal Vasquez?" he asked with exaggerated patience. "Sergeant, I request permission to demonstrate a weapon from my personal kit," Elena said, and her voice carried no emotion whatsoever, which several of the more perceptive aliens found oddly unsettling. Keth Vorn's forearms spread wide in a gesture of theatrical welcome, and his scales shifted to an amused yellow as he nodded his approval. "By all means," he said while gesturing toward the demonstration area. "I am certain we could all use some entertainment. And what better entertainment than watching a human play with sticks and strings?" The laughter that followed was the loudest yet. "And?" Elena simply nodded once before walking to retrieve her case from the equipment storage area at the edge of the training grounds. She moved with a purpose that several recruits would later describe as almost predatory, though none of them understood what they were seeing at the time. Thorvern leaned against the display table with casual arrogance while he waited, already composing the jokes he would tell his fellow instructors later that evening about the foolish human who had volunteered for her own humiliation. He had no way of knowing that his understanding of primitive weapons was about to be fundamentally and permanently altered. Elena returned carrying a long black case that bore no markings or insignia, and something about the way she held it made Keth Vorn's scales flicker uncertainly for just a moment before he dismissed the feeling as irrelevant. "Whenever you are ready, Corporal," he said with a dismissive wave of two hands while the other two remained crossed. Elena set the case on the ground and knelt beside it with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. And when she opened the lid, the morning light of Vareth 9 fell upon something that would change everything. The weapon that Elena lifted from the case was unlike anything Keth Vorn had ever seen in his 40 years of military service, and he found himself leaning forward despite his determination to appear unimpressed. It was a crossbow, but to call it simply a crossbow would be like calling a warship simply a boat. The limbs were compound, a complex arrangement of cables and pulleys that multiplied force in ways that most alien engineers would need hours to fully understand. And the rail was constructed from carbon fiber that had been woven at the molecular level by machines that existed only on Earth. The stock was ergonomic and adjustable, designed to fit against a human shoulder with perfect precision. And mounted on top was a telescopic sight that incorporated range-finding technology and wind adjustment calculations. Elena stood and held the weapon with the casual familiarity of someone who had been handling such things since before she could read, and she made no attempt to explain what the gathered aliens were looking at. Word had spread quickly through the academy that something unusual was happening at the training grounds, and by the time Elena finished inspecting her weapon, nearly 200 beings of various species had gathered to watch what they assumed would be an amusing display of human inadequacy. Vorn's scales had shifted to an uncertain gray, but he forced them back toward confident blue through sheer willpower as he addressed his student. "An interesting-looking device," he admitted with a tone that suggested he found it more curious than threatening. but I fail to see how a modified bow could possibly be relevant to modern military operations. Elena did not respond with words. Instead, she reached into the case and withdrew a quiver containing 12 bolts, each one approximately 16 inches long and tipped with tungsten that had been machined to tolerances measured in microns. These bolts had been designed by her great-grandfather, refined by her grandfather, improved by her father, and perfected by Elena herself during her teenage years in the workshop behind her family's home in the mountains of what used to be called Argentina. She selected a single bolt and held it up for the assembled crowd to see, and the morning light glinted off the tungsten tip in a way that made several observers feel suddenly uncomfortable without understanding why. "Sergeant," Elena said in that same emotionless voice, "may I request a target that would be appropriate for demonstrating this weapon's capabilities?" Keth Voren waved dismissively toward the standard training targets that lined one wall of the range. Simple polymer sheets designed to register hits from practice weapons. Those targets are rated to withstand plasma strikes at 30% power, he said with obvious pride. "I'm certain they will be more than adequate for whatever your little stick thrower can produce." Elena shook her head slowly, and something about the gesture made Keth Voren's scales flicker again. "I require something stronger," she said simply. A murmur passed through the crowd, and Keth Voren felt his pride bristle at the implication that his training range was somehow insufficient. "Corporal, I assure you that our facilities are equipped to handle any Category 7 weapon in existence," he said with growing irritation. "And your primitive bow is hardly going to." "The decommissioned Kreth Alley battle drone," Elena interrupted, pointing toward the far end of the range where an old combat unit sat gathering dust. "That one will be adequate." Silence fell across the training grounds. Kreth Alley battle drones were legendary pieces of military hardware, armored with composite plating that could withstand glancing hits from plasma rifles and designed to operate in the most hostile environments the galaxy had to offer. Using one as a target for a primitive kinetic weapon was like using a fortress wall to test a child's slingshot. Voren's forearms uncrossed and dropped to his sides, and his scales shifted through several colors in rapid succession before settling on a confused purple that he could not quite control. "That drone is rated to withstand direct combat engagement," he said slowly. "And you want to shoot it with an arrow?" "A bolt," Elena corrected quietly. "And yes." The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, searching for any sign that this was some kind of joke. But he found nothing in her dark eyes except absolute certainty. "Very well," he said finally, and his voice had lost some of its earlier arrogance. "If you wish to humiliate yourself so thoroughly, I will not stop you." He gestured for the range to be cleared, and the crowd of observers pressed back against the walls while technicians scurried to position the drone at the far end of the firing line. Elena waited with perfect patience while the preparations were made, and she used the time to run her fingers along the crossbow's rail in a gesture that was almost affectionate. Her grandmother had taught her to shoot when she was 7 years old, using a simple recurve bow that had been passed down through their family for 3 generations. Her mother had introduced her to compound bows when she was 12, explaining the physics of mechanical advantage while they hunted deer in the mountain forests. Her father had given her this crossbow on her 18th birthday, and she had spent every day since then understanding its capabilities in ways that the instruction manual could never capture. The drone was positioned, and the range was cleared, and Keth Voren raised one hand to signal that the demonstration could begin. "Whenever you are ready, Corporal," he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Something that might have been the first small seed of doubt. Elena raised the crossbow to her shoulder and settled into a stance that her body knew better than walking, and she pressed her eye to the scope while her breathing slowed to a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The drone was 90 meters away. Positioned at a slight angle that exposed the joint between its chest plate and shoulder assembly, it was a weakness that human weapons designers had identified and exploited for 10,000 years. The place where armor plates met and protection was compromised. Her finger found the trigger with the familiarity of an old friend, and she exhaled half a breath before squeezing with pressure so gradual that even she could not say exactly when the release occurred. The crossbow spoke with a sound like a whispered thread, a mechanical snap that was over almost before it began, and the bolt vanished from sight so quickly that most observers could not track its flight. What happened next would be discussed in the halls of the Academy for years to come. The tungsten-tipped bolt struck the Kreth Alley battle drone exactly where Elena had aimed, and it did not bounce off or glance away or embed itself in the outer plating. It punched through. The bolt penetrated the composite armor that was designed to withstand plasma strikes, passed completely through the drone's internal cavity, exited through the backplate, and buried itself 4 inches deep in the concrete barrier behind the target. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved or spoke or even seemed to breathe. Then the drone, its structural integrity catastrophically compromised, collapsed forward onto the ground with a crash that echoed across the suddenly silent training range. Elena lowered her crossbow and turned to face Keth Voren, whose scales had frozen in a shade of gray that indicated complete shock and whose 4 arms hung limply at his sides. "Humans never stopped improving our primitive weapons," she said quietly, "and we never forgot how to use them." Keth Voren opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out, and for the first time in his 40-year career, the legendary instructor found himself completely and utterly speechless behind him. The crowd of observers remained frozen in stunned silence, and somewhere in the back, a young Tellurian officer was already composing an urgent message to his superiors about what he had just witnessed. The galaxy had underestimated humanity for 5 years. But in that moment on the training grounds of Virith 9, the first crack appeared in that comfortable assumption. Elena simply stood there holding her crossbow, the weapon her family had perfected across generations, and waited for the universe to catch up with what humans had always known. Sometimes the old ways were not obsolete, sometimes they were just waiting. 1 hour after Elena's demonstration, the briefing room on the 3rd floor of the Academy's main building contained more high-ranking officers than it had seen in the past decade. Commander Vethris of the Tellurian High Fleet sat at the head of the long table with his 3 eyes fixed on the human corporal who stood at attention before the assembled brass, and beside him sat representatives from 6 other species whose governments had demanded immediate reports on what had transpired at the training grounds. Sergeant Keth Voren occupied a chair near the back of the room, his scales cycling through shades of humiliated purple and uncertain gray in patterns he could not control, and he had not spoken a single word since the bolt had torn through the battle. Drone the crossbow lay on the table between Elena and the officers, looking somehow more dangerous now that everyone understood what it could do. "Corporal Vasquez," Commander Vethris said in a voice that carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding thousands, "we have all witnessed the recording of your demonstration, and we have many questions that require immediate answers." Elena nodded once, her posture perfect and her expression revealing nothing. "I will answer whatever questions I am permitted to answer, Commander," she replied, and the subtle implication that some answers might be restricted was not lost on anyone in the room. Vethris leaned forward, his elongated skull tilting slightly as his 3 eyes studied the human before him with newfound interest. "First and most pressing," he said, "explain how a primitive projectile weapon achieved penetration that our plasma rifles could not match against that particular target." Elena reached out and lifted one of the tungsten bolts from the quiver that lay beside her crossbow, holding it up so the officers could see it clearly. "This bolt weighs approximately 425 grains," she began, and her voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining something they had understood since childhood. "And the crossbow generates 450 pounds of draw weight, which translates to a launch velocity of approximately 500 feet per second." She paused to let those numbers sink in, then continued, "The tungsten tip is machined to a tolerance of 2 microns and designed to be self-sharpening upon impact, which means it actually becomes more effective as it penetrates rather than less. And the shaft is constructed from carbon composite that maintains rigidity under extreme stress." A Crethely officer whose rocky exterior made him difficult to read shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Those specifications are impressive for a kinetic weapon," he admitted grudgingly, "but they still should not have been sufficient to defeat our armor technology." Elena allowed herself a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "Your armor technology is designed to defeat energy weapons," she explained, "which means it is optimized to disperse heat and redirect electromagnetic radiation. But kinetic penetration operates on entirely different physical principles." She set the bolt down and picked up the crossbow itself. Cradling it with obvious respect, plasma spreads its energy across a surface area, and directed energy weapons must overcome reflective coatings and heat sinks. But a bolt like this concentrates all of its kinetic energy into a contact point smaller than your smallest fingernail. She traced her finger along the tungsten tip. "It does not care about heat dispersal, and it does not care about electromagnetic shielding, and it does not care about the advanced materials your armor is constructed from, because the only thing that matters is whether your armor can physically stop a dense object moving at extreme velocity." And the answer is usually no. The room fell. The room fell. The room fell. Was usually no, sir. Was usually no. Silent as the implications of her words settled over the assembled officers like a cold blanket commander. Vethris exchanged glances with his colleagues before asking the question that everyone wanted to hear answered. How long have humans possessed weapons capable of this performance? Elena considered her response carefully. My great-great-grandfather used a crossbow, very similar to this one, during a conflict on Earth, approximately 150 years ago, she said, and he considered it somewhat outdated. Even then, the silence that followed was deafening. Vinchari officer, whose tentacles had been nervously coiling and uncoiling throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. Why would your species continue developing kinetic weapons after discovering energy technology? She asked, and genuine confusion colored her translated words. We abandoned our own kinetic weapons within decades of our first plasma generators because they seemed utterly obsolete. Elena set the crossbow down and clasped her hands behind her back. Because humans learned a very important lesson during our history, she said. And that lesson is that the weapon your enemy does not expect is the weapon your enemy cannot defend against. She let those words hang in the air before continuing. Energy weapons can be jammed by electromagnetic interference, and plasma rifles can be defeated by reflective armor, and directed energy can be absorbed by shields. But a crossbow produces no energy signature that can be detected, creates no electronic emissions that can be disrupted, and cannot be hacked or disabled by cyber warfare. Her dark eyes swept across the assembled officers. When you fire a bolt, the only warning your target receives is the sound of it passing through their body. Kethvorn made a small sound from the back of the room, something between a cough and a gasp, and his scales had turned a pale shade that several officers had never seen before Elena was not finished. On Earth, we have a saying, she continued, and that saying is never bring a knife to a gunfight. But there is a second part that most people forget, which is unless your enemy is expecting guns. Commander Vethris rubbed one 3-fingered hand across his elongated skull in a gesture that seemed almost human in its expression of overwhelmed confusion. "Are you telling us," he said slowly, "that humanity maintained parallel weapons development across all technological levels, specifically to preserve tactical options that other species abandoned?" Elena nodded. "We also maintained our chemical propellant weapons, our railguns, our coil guns, our spring-powered weapons, our pneumatic weapons, and approximately 30 other categories of kinetic delivery systems," she confirmed. "Because we learned through 10,000 years of killing each other that the moment you become dependent on a single type of weapon is the moment you become vulnerable." She picked up the bolt again and held it toward the light. "This bolt was designed by my great-grandfather in a workshop behind his house, improved by my grandfather using computer modeling, refined by my father using advanced material science, and perfected by me using everything they taught me combined with everything I learned on my own." Her voice carried a quiet pride that several officers found almost unsettling. "4 generations of my family have worked on this design, and we are one of thousands of families on Earth who never stopped believing that the old ways still had value." The Crethely officer, who had spoken earlier, leaned forward with what might have been newfound respect in his gravelly voice. "Your species never stopped preparing for war," he said. "And it was not a question. My species never stopped preparing for every kind of war," Elena corrected gently. "Because we learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the successful management of threats before they can destroy you." She looked around the room at the assembled officers, at the leaders of species who had conquered the stars while humanity was still learning to fly. "You looked at us and saw primitives throwing sticks," she said quietly. "But what you should have seen was the only species in the galaxy that never threw away a weapon that still worked." Commander Vethris sat back in his chair and stared at the human corporal for a long moment before speaking. "Sergeant Kethvorin," he said without looking at the instructor in the back of the room, "I believe your curriculum requires significant revision." Kethvorin's only response was a strangled sound of agreement, and his scales had turned a shade of embarrassed purple that would not return to normal for several days. Elena simply stood at attention and waited, because she had learned patience from 4 generations of weaponsmiths who understood that sometimes the most effective strike was the one your enemy never saw coming. The galaxy was beginning to learn something that Earth had always known: primitive did not mean useless, it meant proven. 3 months after the demonstration that had echoed through the halls of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy, Corporal Ilana Vasquez found herself crouched behind a volcanic rock formation on the hostile surface of Malice 7, with 11 alien soldiers who were learning a very difficult lesson about the difference between theory and practice. The contested zone of Malice 7 was exactly as unpleasant as the briefing had promised. A world of toxic atmosphere and sharp obsidian formations where the Treaty of Vareth prohibited energy weapons of any kind. And the insurgent forces they had been sent to neutralize had established a communications relay in a fortified position approximately 300 meters from their current location. Sergeant Kethvorin crouched beside Elena, his forearms clutching a tension bow that he had been practicing with for 12 weeks, and his scales were shifting through anxious patterns of green and gray that he could not seem to control no matter how hard he tried. "I cannot hit anything with this ridiculous weapon," he whispered harshly through the communication system built into his helmet, "and every time I draw the string my arms shake so badly that my shots go wide by meters." Elena glanced at him with something that might have been sympathy, if it were not overshadowed by the cold focus that had settled over her features the moment they had made planetfall. "You are overthinking it," she replied quietly, "because you are trying to aim the way you would aim a plasma rifle, but bows do not work that way. Behind them, The rest of the squad was in similar distress. A Tellurian private was struggling with a sling that kept wrapping around his elongated fingers, and 2 Krethali warriors were attempting to coordinate their rocky limbs around spear shafts that had clearly been designed for species with more flexible joints. Only Elena seemed comfortable, her crossbow resting easily in her hands with a bolt already loaded and ready. Her body relaxed in the way that only decades of muscle memory could achieve. The relay is defended by approximately 15 hostiles. Cathvorin continued, forcing his attention back to the mission. And our intelligence suggests they are equipped with kinetic weapons similar to our own, which means we have no technological advantage. Elena shook her head slightly. We have me, she said, and there was no arrogance in her voice, only simple statement of fact. Cathvorin's scales flickered with uncertainty, but before he could respond, a shout echoed across the rocky terrain, and the unmistakable sound of projectile weapons filled the toxic air. They had been spotted. Contact front. One of the Krethali warriors bellowed, and chaos erupted as the squad scrambled for cover while enemy fire chipped away at the obsidian formations. Around them, Cathvorin tried to return fire with his bow, but his shot went wide by several meters and accomplished nothing except revealing his position to the enemy. A Tellurian soldier went down with a cry of pain as a metal projectile found the gap in his armor beneath his arm, and 2 more squad members were pinned behind rocks that provided inadequate cover. Elena did not panic. She had hunted in the mountains of Earth since she was old enough to walk, stalking deer through forests where a single misplaced footstep could spook prey that would not return for hours. And she had learned patience from predators who understood that the kill was not about speed, but about position. While her squad mates scrambled and shouted and fired wild shots that hit nothing, Elena moved. She slipped between rock formations with a fluidity that seemed impossible for someone carrying a weapon, her feet finding purchase on surfaces that should have been too smooth to climb. And within 30 seconds, she had reached an elevated position that gave her a clear line of sight to the enemy fortification. The insurgents had not noticed her because they were focused on the obvious targets, the loud aliens who were making enough noise to wake the dead on 3 different worlds. Elena settled into her position and raised the crossbow to her shoulder through the telescopic sight. She could see 7 hostiles in her immediate field of view, each one focused on the firefight below and completely unaware that death had found a perch above them. Her breathing slowed to the rhythm her grandmother had taught her when she was a child, the ancient pattern that hunters had used on Earth for longer than recorded history in. Hold, out, hold, squeeze. The first bolt caught an insurgent in the throat, passing through the gap between his helmet and chest plate with surgical precision, and he dropped without a sound. His companions did not even notice Elena, reloaded with movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. And her second shot found the eye slot of another hostile who had made the mistake of looking in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. 2 down in 4 seconds. And still the enemy had not identified her position. She shifted her aim to a third target, a larger insurgent who appeared to be coordinating the defensive fire, and her bolt punched through his shoulder joint with enough force to spin him around before he collapsed. Now they knew something was wrong, but they still did not know where the death was coming from. Elena continued firing with methodical precision, while her squad mates watched in stunned amazement from their positions below. 1 shot, 1 kill, reload, 1 shot, 1 kill. She had fired 7 bolts in 90 seconds, and 7 enemies lay dead or dying on the rocky ground, each one struck in the precise locations that 10,000 years of human warfare had taught her ancestors to target: the joints where armor plates met, the gaps where visors connected to helmets, the spaces beneath arms and between legs where protection was. Sacrificed for mobility, humans had been killing each other for so long that they had developed an intimate understanding of exactly where the body was most vulnerable. And Elena carried that terrible knowledge in her hands, like an inheritance passed down through generations of hunters and warriors and soldiers. The remaining insurgents broke and ran, their morale shattered by an enemy they could not see and could not fight. Kethvorin watched them flee with his scales frozen in a pattern of absolute shock, and he realized that in all his decades of military service, he had never witnessed anything quite like what this human had just accomplished. "Clear," Elena announced through the communication system, her voice as calm as if she had just finished a training exercise rather than single-handedly eliminating half of the enemy force. She descended from her position and rejoined the squad, pausing only to check on the wounded Tellurian, whose injury turned out to be painful but not life-threatening. "How did you do that?" a young Kreth Ali warrior asked, his rocky features somehow conveying the awe that his voice could not fully express. Elena ejected the bolt from her crossbow and began the process of reloading for the advance on the now undefended relay. "I have been hunting since I was 7 years old," she said simply, "and my father used to tell me that the difference between a good shot and a great shot is not skill or talent, but understanding that every shot is a conversation between the hunter and the hunted." She looked up at the young warrior with dark eyes that seemed much older than her years. "The prey tells you where it is vulnerable through the way it moves and the armor it wears and the directions it watches," she continued. "And your job as the hunter is to listen to what it is saying and then answer in a language it cannot argue with." Kethvorin approached her slowly, his bow hanging forgotten in two of his hands while the other two hung limply at his sides. "I have led soldiers into combat on 14 different worlds," he said quietly, "and I have never seen anyone move like you moved or shoot like you shot." Elena finished reloading and shouldered her crossbow. "With respect, Sergeant," she replied without any mockery in her tone, "you have never served with humans before." She began walking toward the now silent enemy position, and after a moment of stunned hesitation, the rest of the squad followed. The relay fell without further resistance, and the mission was declared a complete success with 0 coalition casualties. But Kethvorin would remember this day for the rest of his life, because it was the day he truly understood what humanity had been doing during all those centuries when the rest of the galaxy thought they were simply throwing sticks at each other. They had been perfecting the art of killing, and they had become very, very good at it. 6 months after the Battle of Malice-7, the training grounds of the Galactic Coalition Military Academy looked exactly as they had before, with the purple sun casting long shadows across the same worn stones and the same distant mountains framing the horizon. But something fundamental had changed. Corporal Elena Vasquez no longer stood at the end of the formation waiting to be mocked. Instead, she stood at the front of the classroom, wearing the insignia of the Coalition's first primitive kinetics combat instructor, and she surveyed the 63 recruits assembled before her with the patient calm of someone who had learned to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. They came from 20 different species this time, drawn from worlds scattered across the galaxy, and each one of them had specifically requested this assignment after hearing stories that had spread through the military, like wildfire stories of a human who had punched through battle drone armor with a weapon that looked like something from a museum, stories of a silent killer who had eliminated 7 enemies in 90 seconds without ever being seen, stories of a species that had never forgotten the old ways of War Sergeant Kethvorin sat in the back row, his scales displaying a respectful gold that he had specifically chosen to honor the occasion, and his forearms were folded comfortably across his chest as he prepared to learn from a teacher. He had once mocked Elena. Let the silence stretch for a moment, allowing the weight of anticipation to build. Before she began to speak, the galaxy looked at humanity and saw primitives, she said, her voice carrying across the training grounds with quiet authority. and they saw a species still throwing sharpened sticks at each other while others were wielding the power of stars. She paused and lifted her crossbow from the table beside her. The same weapon her grandmother had used, and her mother had improved, and her father had given her. What they did not understand, she continued, is that we never stopped sharpening those sticks. A murmur passed through the assembled recruits, and Elena allowed it to fade before continuing. Every species in this coalition abandoned kinetic weapons when they discovered energy technology, and every species considered this a sign of advancement and progress. But humans made a different choice. She ran her fingers along the crossbow's rail with obvious affection. We kept our kinetic weapons, and we kept improving them, not because we were too primitive to move on, but because we understood something that the rest of the galaxy forgot. Her dark eyes swept across the assembled faces, each one watching her with rapt attention. The best weapon is not the most advanced weapon, she said, and it is not the most powerful weapon, and it is not the most expensive weapon, because the best weapon is the one that accomplishes your objective when you need it to. She loaded a bolt with movements so smooth, they seemed almost ritualistic. Energy weapons can be jammed, she continued, and plasma can be deflected, and shields can be raised. But there is no electronic countermeasure that will stop a piece of tungsten moving at 500 feet per second, and there is no shield generator that can prevent a bolt from finding the gap in your armor. She raised the crossbow and aimed at a target on the far side of the range. A new target that had been specifically designed to withstand kinetic penetration. When I fire this weapon, she said, without taking her eye from the scope, the bolt will produce no energy signature that your sensors can detect, and it will create no electronic emissions that your equipment can track, and it will generate no heat bloom that your thermal systems can identify. Her finger found the trigger. The only warning you will receive is the sound of your armor failing. She fired, and the bolt streaked across the range and punched through the center of the target with a crack that echoed across the training grounds. And by then, Elena concluded as she lowered the weapon, it will be far too late. The silence that followed was not the mocking silence of before, but the respectful silence of students who understood they were in the presence of a Master Ray, young Vinchari. In the front row, raised one tentacle hesitantly. Instructor Vasquez. She said, why would humans choose to maintain such a broad range of weapon technologies when focusing on a single advanced system would be more efficient? Elena set the crossbow down and clasped her hands behind her back, because efficiency assumes you know what challenges you will face. She replied, and humans learned through painful experience that the universe has a way of presenting challenges you did not expect. She began pacing slowly before the assembled recruits, her movements carrying the easy confidence of someone completely comfortable in their own skin. 10,000 years ago, my ancestors fought each other with rocks and sharpened sticks, and they learned that the warrior who could adapt to changing circumstances was the warrior who survived. She explained, 5,000 years ago, my ancestors fought with swords and bows, and they learned that the army that could switch tactics faster than their enemy could predict was the army that won. 500 years ago, my ancestors fought with guns and artillery, and they learned that the nation that maintained multiple military capabilities was the nation that could respond to threats from any direction. She stopped pacing and turned to face the class directly. And 50 years ago, when humanity finally reached the stars and discovered that we were not alone, we looked at the galaxy and we asked ourselves a very important question. Her voice dropped to something almost intimate. We asked, what if our new neighbors become our new enemies? The recruits shifted uncomfortably, and Elena allowed the discomfort to settle before continuing. We did not know how your weapons worked, or what defenses you had developed, or what tactics you preferred. But we knew one thing with absolute certainty. She picked up the crossbow again. We knew that we had 10,000 years of experience in finding ways to kill each other. And we knew that experience would be relevant no matter what technology the galaxy threw at us. She held the weapon out toward the class, displaying it like a sacred artifact. This crossbow represents 4 generations of my family's work, and it represents thousands of years of human innovation. And it represents a philosophy that the galaxy dismissed as primitive. Her voice hardened with quiet pride. But that philosophy kept humanity alive through ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. And that philosophy will keep humanity alive no matter what challenges the universe presents. She lowered the weapon and looked at each recruit in turn. Today, you begin learning that philosophy for yourselves. And you will learn not only how to use these weapons, but why humans never stop believing in them. Cathvorn straightened in his seat at the back of the room, his scales shifting to an even, deeper gold as he prepared to absorb every word. You will learn that primitive does not mean ineffective. Elena continued, and you will learn that simple does not mean useless. And you will learn that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy has forgotten to fear. She smiled, and there was something ancient and knowing in that expression. Something that spoke of caves and campfires and the endless patience of predators who had learned to wait for exactly the right moment. And when you have learned these things, she concluded, you will understand why the galaxy should be very glad that humans are your allies rather than your enemies. She raised the crossbow one final time. Now, she said, let us begin. The lesson that followed would reshape coalition military doctrine for generations to come. And the stories of human weapons expertise would spread to every corner of civilized space. But perhaps the most important change was written in the memoirs that Cathvorn would publish many years later. After a long career spent learning from the species he had once dismissed, I spent 40 years mastering weapons that could level cities, he wrote, and I believed I understood the nature of warfare. But then a human showed me that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy has forgotten to fear. He paused in his writing, remembering the day when a young corporal had loaded an ancient crossbow and changed everything he thought he knew. Humanity never stopped sharpening their sticks, he concluded, and the galaxy would do well to remember that the species who crawled out of caves with rocks in their hands is the same species that will be standing beside us when the universe throws its worst at our door. Because humans do not forget their weapons, and they do not forgive those who underestimate them. The words would be quoted in military academies across the galaxy for centuries. A permanent reminder of the lesson that humanity had taught the stars. Never mock the primitive, because sometimes the primitive is just getting started.